This is Closer to the Fire from the Voice of the Martyrs Canada, with a focus on the persecuted church around the world. I'm Greg Musselman. On February 13th, 2017, Malaysian Pastor Raymond Koh was kidnapped in broad daylight. Pastor Koh was abducted by a group of men in the greater Kuala Lumpur area while he was on his way to a friend's house. It was captured on CCTV, and there were men in 3 black vehicles, SUVs in fact, and they abducted the pastor. The Human Rights Commission of Malaysia concluded that the men were working for a special branch of the Royal Malaysian Police. More than 7 years later, his wife Susanna continues to search tirelessly for answers regarding her husband's disappearance. And a part of this process, she filed a lawsuit in 2020 against the Malaysian government for negligence. And to show that Pastor Raymond's disappearance was being investigated, the government formed a task force to allegedly look into the incident. And there's been further developments in the case. And joining me to talk about that case is Todd Nettleton. He is the host of Voice of the Martyrs Radio, also vice president of Message for VOM US, and also the author of a book that we featured here on Closer to the Fire, When Faith is Forbidden, 40 Days on the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians. Todd, great to see you again.
It's great to see you too. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, I hear you often on Christian radio and other media. You're doing a great job. Appreciate all that you do for the persecuted church. I was thinking the other day, we've been on several trips, but it's together, but it's been a while. And I think it's maybe 25 years. So we're kind of the veterans with the persecuted church now. We started out as young guys way back then. But again, I appreciate all that you're doing. So I want to talk about this case with Pastor Raymond Koh and his wife, Susanna. 7 years, Todd, you have been covering this story for all these years. What are you hearing about his situation? Do we even know if he's alive?
We don't. And that's really the point of the civil case that Susanna, his wife, has filed against the Malaysian government, against the police, including naming police officers in the lawsuit. That's her whole point in this process is I want to know the truth. I want to know what happened to my husband. I'll never forget going to Southeast Asia to interview Susanna several years ago. And one of the things she said, honestly, it kind of haunts me. She said, every morning I wake up and wonder what happened to my husband. Is he alive? Is he dead? Is he being mistreated? Is he being cared for? What is happening with my husband? And we're now we're almost to the 8-year mark of her waking up every morning asking those questions. She's trying to get answers. And I pray that through this legal process, she will get the answers that she's looking for.
I do as well. And I can't imagine, the situation that she's in. And you and I have interviewed many, many widows that have lost their husbands. At least they can go on. I mean, there's the hope that maybe he's still alive. There has been, as you mentioned, no reports of him still being alive. But she filed that case against the government back in 2020. What was the result of that?
Well, the case is ongoing. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, she was back in court. Their court hearing process is very different from ours here in the U.S., at least. We typically would have a court hearing and then the next day and the next day until we're done, until we get to a verdict. They kind of have a hearing, and then a month later, they have another day of hearings, and then maybe a month or two later, they have another day of hearings. So it is a very long process. One of the things that's come out of this, though, is there was a top secret report done by the Malaysian government that has now been handed over to Susanna. They now have access to that report. And so that is now, they're asking questions based on the government's own report and trying just to get answers. Because like you say, we don't know if that security camera had not caught the abduction of Raymond Koh, right, it would literally be as if he fell off the face of the earth. He's never been seen or heard from since that day. His car has never been located since that day. If that security camera hadn't caught the abduction, it would be like the earth opened up and swallowed him. He would have just disappeared. And it's important to note that security camera footage wasn't found by the police. That was found by Susanna and her family as they went literally door to door along the route that they knew he would have taken. And they're the ones who uncovered that security footage, not the police. So that's an important part of this, because without that footage, there really would be no case. It would just be like he disappeared.
It looks like one of those movies that, and it's a bit grainy, but you can tell what is going on. And again, the perseverance of Susanna and her family is amazing. But because there has been no proof of life, does Susanna still really believe that Pastor Koh is still alive?
I don't know the answer to that. It's hard to say what she believes. I think she certainly hopes for a reunion with him. She hopes that he can be back with her, back with their children. At the same time, you think about now more than 7 years he's been gone. Well, what could have been happening to him? That's hard to think about, what he could have been facing all these years. So I think it's a really hard question to say, hey, what do you hope for? Because it's kind of like there's two bad answers.
Yes, there are two bad answers. He's either alive and maybe in terrible conditions, or he's passed away. I guess from the biblical perspective, he's with the Lord. He knew the Lord. He was a strong pastor and a very influential man. Todd, do you think that they were had him under surveillance for some time before they actually did that? When they kidnapped him in broad daylight like that?
We know that there had been threats against him prior to the abduction. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Susanna told me they received a box in the mail with 2 bullets inside of it. So not a very subtle sort of way to threaten somebody. Hey, this all dates back. It's very interesting in light of what persecution looks like in Malaysia. This dates back to Pastor Raymond Koh's work with a nonprofit organization there that helped the downtrodden. They helped the poor. They helped AIDS patients. They really helped the downtrodden in society, not based on religion. They didn't only help Christians or only help Muslims. They helped anyone who wanted help. that organization held a banquet, kind of a dinner, to thank their donors. And the dinner was held at a church building. So it was not a church function. It was a function of the nonprofit. It was not a religious event at all. It was simply a thank you dinner. Thank you for supporting our work. Well, here's the thing. Some of their donors were ethnic Malay people, and it is illegal for you to witness or share the gospel with an ethnic Malay person. And so the police came to that fundraiser and they're like, hey, what's going on here? You've got ethnic Malays in a church building. You can't have that happen. And they were like, well, we're not having a church service. We're just having a thank you dinner for our donors. Some of the, they tried to explain it all, but it really seems like from that day forward, he has been a target, at least under surveillance, at least under observation, and watched by the government because of that dinner and because there were ethnic Malay people at this event that was held at a church. Again, not a church service, not a church event, but on a church property in a church's building. And that seems to be what sort of got him on the radar of the government.
So he's kidnapped almost 8 years ago, broad daylight. The government said they were investigating. They put out a report. Then they didn't want to release the report. They, cited secrecy and all the rest of that. We've, of course, heard that many times. But eventually a judge in the case said, no, Susanna and her lawyer, they should have access to it. They see the report. It's all, redacted, and they can't see a lot of the things that are actually in there. And now apparently they do have a report. Is that what I understand, Todd, where they actually are seeing what the government found out, supposedly?
That's my understanding, yes. And it's interesting you mentioned that initial report. So the judge orders the government, hey, you have to turn over this report. They turn over a report that is, quote unquote, watermarked, but it's watermarked on every line of every page of the report. Like you couldn't read the report. You couldn't look at the pictures in the report. The whole thing was essentially ruined by that watermark. And so it's kind of like they're thumbing their nose at the judge at his ruling. But as you mentioned, the judge came back and said, no, you have to turn over a report that they can actually see and read. They have done that now. And now that is affecting the strategy for Susanna's lawyers as they pursue this case. One of the other interesting things, though, now they interview someone that was on the commission that formed this report, that signed off on the report, and he acted on the witness stand like it was the first time he'd ever seen it. It was his signature on as was part of issuing this report. But on the witness stand in her case, he's like, wow, this is really the first time I'm looking at this. I didn't really know it said that. And so at every step along the way, it just seems like the government is doing everything in their power to not answer questions, to not find the truth. And that goes back all the way to February 13th of 2017, when Susanna went to the police station that night and said, my husband has disappeared. He didn't come home. I want to file a missing persons report. Instead of asking the questions that you would ask, well, where was your husband going? Who was he going to talk to today? What kind of car does he drive? They didn't ask any of those questions. Instead, they started asking Susanna about, why do you witness to Malay people? Why do you tell them to become Christians? So from the very first night, the police have shown zero interest in actually pursuing this as a criminal investigation. And they have only shown interest in covering up what happened and in prosecuting and persecuting Susanna and her husband for their work as Christians in Malaysia.
I guess if you're from their perspective, they don't want to release this report, especially if they're involved, which it appears to be, at least at some level of the government. So this report, if it is unredacted and the watermarks are taken away and she sees the photos and all that kind of thing, I mean, do you really even feel, Todd, that will actually happen, that she will, get to hear or at least get to read what may have happened to her husband?
I don't know what the report says, and I'm very curious about that because I'm very curious to know what kind of investigation did the police do. We know that one of the commissioners that issued this report was actually part of the special branch of the police, which is apparently involved in the abduction. So it's hard to believe that he would want that truth to come out there. And it's, curious to know what kind of work he might have done on the commission to steer the report in a different direction. there's so many questions at this point, and it appears now that they are identifying a person involved with the investigation. They're saying, though, that he wasn't actually an officer in the special branch. He was a contract worker. And so it looks like they're already trying to sort of distance themselves and say, oh, yeah, there may have been some individual officers involved on their own time, but this was not a police operation. This was not something their superiors told them to do. It'll be interesting to see in the months to come how the government tries to maneuver around this and what the end result of this case is. Again, Susanna her goal is not to get rich off of the government. Her goal is to find out the truth of what happened to Pastor Raymond Koh. It will be very interesting to see if this civil court process really gets into and makes public what that truth is.
Todd, when you look at that footage, it's hard to imagine that the government at some level was not involved in this kidnapping, broad daylight. Again, it looked like a movie that we might see. And when you look at it and you see, okay, the government's likely involved. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's already been sort of said out there. But for Susanna, she has continued to keep this fight up. And as you've talked to her in the past, what is it about her that makes her so determined? Some may just give up and go, there's no hope here, but she's not that way.
She's not that way at all. And I'm glad you mentioned the CCTV footage, because we're talking about at least 5 vehicles involved in this abduction, at least 13 men, and the whole thing took less than 40 seconds. So this is not like some teenagers decided they're going to grab somebody up and sort of randomly did it. This was highly organized. They obviously had practiced. They knew what they were doing. That's why it appears to be a police operation. It's not amateurs. It was professionals who did this. The question about what keeps Susanna going, I think her courage is really amazing in this situation. And she told me when she went to hire a lawyer to sue the government, the lawyer kind of looked at her like, are you serious? Like this is the government that made your husband disappear. Are you sure you want to poke the bear? You want to go after them in court? Well, that's going to put a target on your back. Sure. And she said, I understand that. I want to know the truth. I want to know what happened to my husband. And so she has been incredibly courageous throughout this whole process. The other thing that is such a testimony is her faithfulness and how she shares that the Lord has encouraged her. The Lord has renewed her. The Lord has been with her. And I remember the first time that I talked to her, she talked about really feeling frustrated with some of the police officers. Like they didn't want to know the truth. They didn't want to find her husband. They were clearly covering things up. And she said, I wanted to grab them and kind of slap them and wake up, which I think all of us can understand. Sure. But she said, the Lord really convicted me. I need to love them. I need to pray for them. And she said, I confess to the Lord, I am sorry for these bad feelings I'm having. Help me to love them. And the Lord has really sustained her to respond with love. Now, not acceptance, not, hey, I'm going to not drop my case, but with, I don't hate you. I'm not angry with you. I simply want to know the truth, and I want to love you with the love that the Lord has given me. And so I think the Lord has clearly sustained her through this and the prayers of God's people around the world. I'm so thankful for the people who follow VOM Canada, who follow VOM USA, who listen to VOM Radio, who have prayed for Susanna. They have sent her cards and letters and encouragement. That has made a huge difference for her and her family.
Do you know how she's able to survive, Todd, just paying the bills and, with her children and being in the community there? Do you have any idea of that?
Well, she is still running the nonprofit that her and Raymond founded. And so they are still doing ministry. They're still doing outreach there in Malaysia. She also has a business that she runs that helps to support her. So she is still keeping on with her life while at the same time pursuing this court process and hoping for the truth, hoping to know what happened to her husband, Pastor Raymond Koh.
This weekend, as we, air this podcast, it'll be the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. And here in Canada, the focus is on women. the victims really of persecution. I mean, you and I have traveled a lot, and many of the times that we have had these interviews, it's with women who have lost their husbands or children who have lost their dads. And I just think of somebody like Susanna Koh, and the way that she has been so persevering and her faith has not wavered. She loves her husband. She misses her husband. And we pray that there will be a reunion.
Let me say one more thing about Susanna, because there's a
Sure.
real connection to VOM with Susanna, because the same thing happened to our founder, Pastor Richard Wurmbrand.
Yes.
He was kidnapped off the streets on his way to church one Sunday, and his wife, Sabina, didn't know what happened to him. Now, they didn't have CCTV footage, so she didn't get to see the abduction, but she was in that same situation. Hey, my husband has just disappeared. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know where he is. And there were many months where she did not know what had happened to Richard Wurmbrand. So ever since the first day of Pastor Raymond Koh's abduction, we have kind of identified with Susanna, because that is a part of our VOM story. And to see her going through that same thing, and also having the same courage and the same spirit that Sabina had, to love her enemies, to forgive those who are persecuting her. So that's really an interesting connection for those of us here at VOM to this story, because it does kind of mirror what happened to Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand.
Yeah, that is a great connection. Richard Wurmbrand, captured off the street. They, put him in prison, and his family have no idea where he was. And again, I do like that connection, because that is what, Susanna is facing with the abduction of her husband, Raymond Koh. And we'll continue to pray that they will be reunited if, in fact, he's still alive.